Chair, that is deeply troubling about this miscellaneous part of the bill.
I call Nikki Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise to speak on this Part 4 of the bill, and yes, it does cover a series of miscellaneous issues, including the transitionary provisions and consequential amendments. It's really the nuts and bolts of how this legislation will work. It covers things like the detail of the cost recovery provisions, the servicing of documents, the rules and regulations around sensitive information and waivers and exemption. And finally, it includes a schedule relating to inspection powers. Now, we know that this legislation is part of a whole suite of acts that cover the EEZ and the continental shelf, marine environment, and it fills the gaps. So this provides a legislative framework to manage, monitor activities and protect the environment. So there are significant amendments to be made to existing legislation, which is also done in Part 4. But I'd just like to focus on the transitional provision, particularly clause 151A. Now, Moana Maki, she was saying that she's having difficulty understanding these clauses, and I would like to explain. Also, Eugenie Sage asked us the question about 151A. Now, this clause concerns activities such as prospecting, exploration or mining for petroleum activities, which are authorised by a permit. And a planned activity is authorised by a permit. And that permit is granted under Section 25 or Section 107 of the Crown Minerals Act 1991. Excuse me. In other words, these are activities that are legally permitted before the Act that we're talking about now. This Act requires operators to prepare an impact assessment and provide it to the EPA. And however, under the Ministry's supplementary order paper, this activity may continue without a marine consent after the date that the Act comes into force for 12 months or to the very latest date of May 2014. And that also answers Moana Maki's question about Petrobras. As it is, Petrobras do not have a mining permit, so they can't mine, they can only prospect. They have an exploration permit, but the transitory provisions only last for 12 months after the regulations become law, with a final date of May 2014. So, finally, whatever happens, the end of that happens in 2014, then they have to go to the marine consenting process. Now, it may seem that the Minister's supplementary order paper gives prospectors more leeway than the original bill, but this is not the case. Let me explain. The clause 151A concerns the prospecting information. Now, the original bill required an application for marine consent to be made within 6 months. Okay, so we had to put the marine consent in within 6 months, but work could continue until the final decision was made on that application, which could be 12 months. So what the Minister's supplementary order paper doesn't change the outcome. Now, the problem with the timing of the original was that the prospecting work would have already been completed before the consent decision was made, and therefore the consent would be redundant, which actually would make a bit of a mockery of the whole process, and I don't think it would be a good way to introduce our new legislation. Now, prospecting for petroleum only takes place in the summer months, so there would be no activity underway while the company was preparing its consent up until November 2013, but while it was waiting for that decision, the work would be underway and completed before the consent was issued in May 2014. So the SOP no longer requires an interim marine consent application, which, as you would see, would only come after the work had been done, so would have been a waste of everybody's time. But it definitely requires a consent before the following prospecting season. So the Minister's change doesn't affect the outcome. It is not a softening up of the legislation, but it does give more certainty to those who have planned, authorised activities during the summer of 2013. And I have to say that I think that's a reasonable and rational decision which does give credibility to the legislation. There would be nothing more galling to somebody who was prospecting to have to go through all the process of applying for a consent, waiting for the decision, but by the time the decision came, the work had been done. It would be foolish if they refused, Mr. Speaker, and of course it would have no use at all if they approved it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Grant Robertson.
Mr. Chair, I think for the call and for the member